Chapter 1. The Invitation. There are houses that seem to watch the world. Windmere House was one of them. It stood upon the cliffs of Devon, half shrouded in mist and half remembered in rumour, its windows reflecting the grey sea below, its stones damp with the breath of the ocean. To those who passed along the coastal road, it appeared serene, even stately. But those who knew better, those who had once crossed its threshold, would tell you that stillness was not peace. It was waiting. Miss Marple arrived on a pale afternoon in June of 1952. The train left her at a small, forgotten station, where the platform smelled faintly of coal smoke and wild thyme. A single porter loaded her modest case into a waiting motor car, a silver Morris that looked as though it had seen the last good years of the war. Its driver, a man with sea-weathered hands, tipped his cap politely. "Windmere House, is it—" he asked. She nodded, and with that, her quiet journey began. The road to Windmere wound along the cliffs like a grey ribbon. Below, the tide surged against black rocks, bursting in sprays of white foam. The wind carried the cries of gulls and something else, a low moan that might have been the sea or memory. Miss Marple sat with her gloved hands folded neatly on her lap, her eyes tracing the coastline. She had seen such places before, places that hid their histories beneath respectable surfaces. And though her invitation had spoken of rest and seaside air, she knew instinctively that rest was not what awaited her. The invitation had come from Mrs. Alicia Redford, a woman of grace and certain age, once a beauty, now a widow. Her late husband, Henry Redford, had made his fortune in shipping, though some whispered he had profited more from wartime scarcity than honest trade. Since his death, Alicia had lived alone at Windmere House, surrounded by servants, roses, and the ghost of a life she could not quite leave behind. The letters she sent had been kind but oddly urgent. "Do come, my dear Miss Marple. It would be a comfort to have you here for a few days. I fear the house has grown too quiet." Too quiet. It was a phrase that often preceded trouble. When the car at last reached the great iron gates of Windmere, the sky had turned the color of pewter. The driver honked once. The gates opened with a long metallic sigh. The drive curved through ancient oaks until, at its end, the house emerged, broad, grey, and solemn against the horizon. It was not a warm house. Its windows, tall and dark, seemed to withhold their secrets even in daylight. And yet there was beauty, the kind of beauty that age lent to things built by those who believed in permanence. Alicia Redford met her at the door, her smile delicate, her hands soft and cold. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, though her eyes were restless, "you've come at just the right time." She led her through a hall lined with portraits, generations of Redfords looking down in oil and gilt. Their eyes, like those of the living, were full of quiet judgment. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Somewhere, a clock ticked the seconds away with exaggerated solemnity. It was, to outward appearances, a pleasant household. There was a housekeeper, Mrs. Price, stiff, efficient, and not particularly fond of visitors. There was Dr. Nathaniel Crow, a frequent caller, who had served as Alicia's physician since her husband's passing. And there was another guest, a younger woman, elegantly dressed, with eyes that watched everything but revealed nothing. Her name was Clara Davenport. The introduction was polite but cool, and when Clara took Alicia's arm at dinner that evening, Miss Marple thought she detected the faintest tension beneath their smiles. Dinner itself was a quiet affair. The long table, lit by 2 silver candelabra, reflected more shadow than flame. Conversation moved in slow, careful steps about the garden, the weather, the war that was 7 years gone yet never quite gone enough. Miss Marple listened. She always listened. Alicia spoke with that bright politeness common to those concealing unease. Dr. Crow drank more than was good for him, and Clara, though smiling, glanced often toward the empty chair at the far end of the table, as though expecting someone who never arrived. It was during dessert, a rather fine lemon tart, that Alicia mentioned her stepson. "Julian should have been home by now," she said softly. "He went to London on business last week." "Business?" Clara asked, too quickly. Alicia hesitated. "Something to do with the foundation. He manages the accounts now, you see." Miss Marple nodded politely, but she caught the quick exchange of looks, one sharp, one weary. She had seen that look before. In village parlors, in country lanes, It was a look of a bond broken, and perhaps of guilt shared. After dinner, the wind rose again, rattling the tall windows. Miss Marple retired early, pleading fatigue from travel. Her guest room overlooked the sea, its curtains stirring in the draught. She unpacked her knitting, set her spectacles on the bedside table, and sat for a while in the stillness. From below, faint music drifted upward, a record spinning somewhere in the drawing room, a waltz from another age. And beneath it, a voice, low, strained, Alicia's, then another, younger, sharper, Clara's. Their words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, accusation, regret, and something perilously close to fear. Miss Marple rose, crossed to the window, and looked out at the darkened garden. A single figure moved among the roses, a lantern in hand, Dr. Crow, perhaps, or the gardener, but the house itself remained alive with tension. It was a kind of silence that settles before confession or collapse. In her years, Miss Marple had learned that evil rarely enters a place suddenly. It grows there, like mold in the corners of conscience, fed by vanity, love, or greed. Windmere House had that smell about it already, and as the storm rolled in from the sea, she knew that before her stay was over, something terrible would rise to the surface. She extinguished her lamp. The wind sighed against the glass like a restless spirit, and in that moment, as lightning flashed beyond the cliffs, she thought she saw, or imagined she saw, a figure standing by the garden wall, watching the house with unblinking patience. When the thunder broke, it shook the walls themselves, and Windmere seemed to shudder in its foundations. Miss Marple closed her eyes, folded her hands, and whispered softly into the darkness. People are much the same everywhere. Only their secrets change. Morning at Windmere came reluctantly, as though the house itself would have preferred to remain asleep. Mist lay heavy over the bay, swallowing the cliffs in soft, merciless white. The sea was silent now, but beneath that silence there was weight, the kind that presses upon a place when too many truths are waiting to be spoken. Miss Marple descended to breakfast with her usual quiet grace. Alicia Redford was already there, dressed impeccably in dove-gray silk, a string of pearls glimmering faintly at her throat. She greeted Miss Marple with warmth, but her hands trembled as she poured the tea. The cup rattled slightly against its saucer. "You must forgive me," Alicia said softly. "I scarcely slept. The storm was dreadful, wasn't it?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, quite dreadful. But storms do serve a purpose. They clear the air." Alicia looked up sharply, as though uncertain whether that was comfort or warning. Moments later, Clara Davenport entered the room. She wore crimson, the color of defiance, and her perfume arrived before she did. Her eyes, behind the thin veil of fatigue, still glimmered with the restless energy of a woman unaccustomed to patience. She offered Miss Marple a polite good morning, then turned to Alicia. "Any word from Julian?" she asked, her voice carefully casual. Alicia's lips tightened. "Not yet, but I expect he'll come down today." That single word, expect, hung in the air like a thread stretched to breaking. Miss Marple stirred her tea without looking up. The habit of years, listening without seeming to, had become her art. She had learned that people, when not directly questioned, reveal themselves more truthfully in what they do not say. And there, beneath the civility of breakfast, lay something raw. Alicia's grief was not merely for the dead, but for the living who could still wound her. Later, as the fog began to lift, a motor car was heard along the drive. Its engine broke the morning calm, and within minutes the maid came rushing in. "Mr. Julian," she said breathlessly. "He's just arrived." Julian Redford entered the hall with the careless poise of a man who has never known denial. Tall, broad-shouldered, immaculately dressed in a navy suit that had been pressed by someone else's patience. His smile was charming, but his eyes were not. They were the eyes of a man who measures a room before he greets it. "Mother," he said, bending to kiss Alicia's cheek. She received it with grace, but her expression was taut, affection layered with unease. Julian turned to the others, offering courteous introductions. When his gaze fell on Clara, there was a flicker, recognition, memory, and the faintest shadow of guilt. He masked it quickly, but not quickly enough for Miss Marple. The day unfolded with a kind of brittle politeness. Alicia suggested a walk along the cliffs after luncheon, a tradition. She said her husband had loved. The air smelled of salt and damp earth. The cliffs themselves were treacherous, the edges crumbling into nothingness, and the sea far below restless as conscience. Julian walked ahead with Clara, their voices low, too low for Alicia's hearing but not for Miss Marple's discerning observation. From a distance, their figures looked almost tender, two young people caught in the melancholy of love unwise. But there was tension in their posture, in the way Clara's hand gripped her scarf against the wind, in the way Julian kept glancing back at the house, as though fearing that every window watched them. Alicia followed a few steps behind, her cane tapping lightly against the stones. "He was always reckless," she murmured, half to herself, "even as a boy." Miss Marple glanced at her, her voice soft. "Recklessness is often a disguise for shame, I find." Alicia's mouth curved in a humorless smile. "And what do you think shame disguises, Miss Marple?" "Fear," came the quiet reply. "Almost always fear." They stopped at a small stone bench overlooking the bay. From here, the house appeared diminished, almost fragile against the vastness of sea and sky. Alicia sat, her face turned to the wind. "You have a curious gift," she said after a pause, "for seeing things that aren't meant to be seen." "I simply notice what others choose to overlook," Miss Marple said gently. "It's astonishing what one can learn by listening." Alicia looked away then, toward Julian and Clara, their figures now distant along the cliff path. "He reminds me so much of his father," she murmured. "Charming, self-assured. But charm, you see, is a dangerous inheritance. It makes a man believe the world owes him forgiveness." By evening, the fog had thickened again. The sound of the sea grew louder, nearer. Miss Marple sat by the drawing-room fire while the others busied themselves with trivialities, letters, piano music, brandy. But beneath it all, tension swelled like a note held too long. When Julian spoke, his tone was smooth. "The Foundation's accounts are in excellent shape. Mother, I've taken care of everything." Alicia's knitting paused mid-stitch. "Taken care," she repeated. "That sounds very final." He smiled. "You needn't trouble yourself. I know what Father would have wanted." The silence that followed was absolute. Clara's eyes lowered, and her hand trembled as she set down her glass. Dr. Crow, sitting in the corner, stared into the flames as though he could read something there that no one else could see. Miss Marple, ever discreet, rose to refill her teacup. But as she passed a writing desk, she noticed something curious, a letter half hidden beneath a stack of papers. Its seal was broken, its handwriting familiar. Julian's, and beside it, a note in Alicia's delicate script. 2 words only, "Not yet." That night, the storm returned. It came without warning, as though summoned by the very secrets that haunted the house. The wind tore at the shutters, the sea hammered the rocks below, and somewhere in the darkness a door slammed, once, twice, like an argument left unresolved. Miss Marple did not sleep. She sat by the fire in her room, the flames flickering across her spectacles, her needles clicking softly. Downstairs, voices rose, muffled, angry. Julian's, Clara's, a crash, then silence. She waited as she always did. And when the quiet finally settled over Windmere again, she knew, with a deep certainty born of years observing the follies of mankind, that before dawn, something in that house would break. Chapter 2. The Storm Breaks. There are some nights when the world seems to hold its breath, as though time itself hesitates, aware that something terrible is about to happen. That was how it felt at Windmere Bay on the night the storm came. The wind rose like a living thing, battering the great old house until the windows rattled and the rafters groaned. Waves hurled themselves at the cliffs, shattering into spray that reached even the garden walls. The lamps flickered, casting the drawing-room in strange, shifting light, a stage set for tragedy. Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, her knitting in her lap. Around her, the household had fractured into uneasy silence. Alicia had retired early, pleading a headache. Clara lingered in the music room, her fingers restless upon the keys of the piano, playing the same few notes again and again. And Julian, well, no one seemed quite sure where Julian had gone. Dr. Crow was the only one who dared move about with purpose, his candle casting a trembling halo as he went from room to room, checking windows, bolting doors. "A night like this," he murmured, "always unsettles people. Nature has a cool way of reminding us how small we are." Miss Marple agreed quietly. She had seen it before, in cottages, in great houses, even in villages that pretended no evil could touch them. Storms stripped away pretense. They revealed what people were when the world stopped listening. At 11:30, a sharp knock echoed through the hall. The butler, pale and visibly shaken, entered to say that the telephone line had gone down. "No way to call the village," he said. "The storm's taken the poles again." Alicia's door opened then. She appeared at the landing, her dressing gown drawn tightly around her, her silver hair undone. "Is everyone safe?" she asked. "Yes," said the butler. "Only the lines are out." Miss Marple looked up, calm as always. "I'm sure we shall manage perfectly well," she said. "After all, we have company and a fine roof over our heads. Some poor souls will be on the road tonight." Her tone was steady, but her eyes had turned toward the window, for there, just beyond the glass, she had seen something, or thought she had. A flicker of movement in the garden, a shadow against the lantern light. A moment later, the piano stopped. Clara Davenport stood by the instrument, her hand frozen above the keys. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" "That sound, out there, like a cry." Dr. Crow frowned and crossed to the French doors, unbolting them just enough to peer into the storm. Wind rushed in, carrying rain like needles. The garden beyond was a chaos of motion. Trees bent double, flowers crushed flat, gravel flying in small stinging clouds. "No one could be out in that," he said firmly, closing the door again. "You must have imagined it." But Miss Marple had not imagined the look on his face. Beneath his calm, there was fear. Midnight came and went. The grandfather clock told 12 solemn strokes, each one swallowed by the roar of the storm. And then silence, so sudden, so complete, it was more terrifying than the noise had been. Miss Marple rose, setting her knitting aside. "If you'll forgive me," she said softly, "I think I'll see that the windows upstairs are secured." Alicia nodded absently. Yes, of course." Upstairs, the corridor stretched long and dim. Her candle flame trembled as she walked, shadows dancing along the paneled walls. From somewhere ahead came a faint, rhythmic sound. Tap, 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 like metal against wood. She followed it, turning the corner toward the study. The door stood slightly ajar. "Mr. Redford," she called gently. "Julian!" No answer. She pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark except for the fire's dying glow. Papers lay scattered across the desk, the remnants of an argument, perhaps. And there, in the great leather chair by the hearth, sat Julian Redford. His head was tilted back, his collar soaked dark, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. The poker from the hearth lay on the floor beside him, slick and glistening in the light. Miss Marple stood very still. Then she did what few would have done. She closed her eyes, folded her hands, and whispered a prayer. When she opened them again, the detective in her had already taken command. By dawn, the storm had passed, but the house was colder than before. Police from the nearby town arrived in solemn silence. Inspector Hale, a practical man with a lined face and an air of perpetual exhaustion. He listened to Miss Marple's calm recounting, his pencil scratching rapidly over his notebook. "Found dead around midnight, you say? And you were the one to discover the body?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, "though I believe the quarrel began rather early in the evening. Voices carry in these old houses." He nodded grimly. "And who would have reason to quarrel with Mr. Redford?" She hesitated, then looked toward the window, where the gray morning light revealed muddy footprints, faint but clear, leading toward the garden. "I think, Inspector," she said gently, "you will find that in this house everyone had a reason." The investigation began with all the predictable chaos of human guilt. Alicia fainted when she was told. Clara wept openly, her grief wild and unrestrained. Dr. Crow grew solemn, taking it upon himself to comfort everyone, but saying very little about where he had been during the storm. Inspector Hale's men combed the grounds. They found a trail of footprints near the terrace, a man's leading away from the study, and beside them, the smaller impressions of a woman's shoes. The footprints ended abruptly near the cliff edge, where the earth had given way. Alicia, pale but composed, insisted on speaking with the inspector privately. "My son was a good man," she said. "Flawed, perhaps, but good. He was misled." "By whom?" asked Hale. Her eyes hardened. "By that woman, Clara Davenport." Miss Marple listened from her chair by the window. She knew better than to interrupt. People told the truth in strange ways, sometimes by what they accused others of. Later that afternoon, she found Clara in the garden, her eyes red, her gloves still muddy. "Miss Davenport," she said softly, "I wonder if I might have a word." Clara turned, her expression sharp with grief and defiance. "You think I killed him," she said. Miss Marple shook her head. "I think you loved him. And love, my dear, is a far more dangerous thing." The younger woman's shoulders trembled. He was going to end it, with his mother, with the estate, everything. He said we'd leave together. But then her voice broke. Then she told him about the money, about the will. "The will?" Miss Marple repeated quietly. "Yes, his father's trust. It would dissolve if Julian married before his 30th birthday. He would have nothing. He was furious, said he'd find a way around it. He said he'd make her pay." Miss Marple sighed softly, looking out toward the bay. "And did he?" Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't know, but I think someone else did." She looked into the fire. Its reflection flickered in her eyes, warm yet unyielding. "And, Doctor," she added quietly, "you might want to wash the mud from your shoes before morning." For a moment he froze, then laughed softly, too softly. "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Marple." "Not remarkable at all," she replied, "just observant." That evening, when the house had fallen again into uneasy silence, Miss Marple sat once more by the drawing-room fire. Dr. Crow entered quietly, a glass of brandy in his hand. "You've been very calm through all this, Miss Marple," he said. "Most would be in shock." "I have seen too many tragedies to be surprised by them," she replied gently. "People rarely die by accident when there is money, love, and pride in the same room." He smiled faintly, though his eyes remained guarded. "You think you know who did it." "I think," she said, "that the truth will find its way. It always does. Much like the tide." Chapter 3. The Confession. Morning returned to Windmere Bay with deceptive gentleness. The storm had scoured the air clean. Sunlight now spilled over the cliffs as if nothing wicked had ever occurred there. Yet within the house, the air hung heavy, thick with the ache of disbelief. Curtains remained drawn, footsteps muffled, and even the servants whispered as if the dead man might still be listening. Inspector Hale lingered in the study, his hat set neatly on the desk beside a small stack of evidence bags. Miss Marple, sitting by the window, appeared the very image of patience, her hands folded, her gaze fixed on the glittering bay below. Hale closed his notebook. "It's rarely as tangled as this," he said quietly. "Everyone under this roof has a motive. But motive without opportunity is nothing, and opportunity without courage is less than nothing." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And yet courage, Inspector, takes many forms. Some murder from rage, others from fear. But the worst," she paused, choosing her words, "the worst murder from love." The inspector looked up sharply. "Love?" "Indeed," she said. "A curious thing, love. It blinds the honest, emboldens the weak, and destroys the guilty. In Windmere, I think, we have all three." That afternoon the inquest was held in the library, a grim, formal ritual that reduced tragedy to testimony. Alicia Redford sat motionless throughout, her face pale as parchment, while Clara Davenport trembled with every question. Dr. Crow spoke calmly, clinically, though his hand betrayed a faint tremor as he described discovering the body. Miss Marple listened without interruption. Her mind ticked quietly beneath a calm exterior, tracing the patterns of human deceit. When it ended, the coroner recorded an open verdict. Death by violence, circumstances uncertain. Uncertain, Miss Marple thought, because no one dared look certainty in the face. That evening, The house emptied of strangers, leaving its inhabitants to their secrets. The sea was calm again, but the calm of exhaustion, not peace. Miss Marple walked the garden path alone, stopping by the terrace where the footprints had once been. The rain had washed them away, but she did not need them now. She could see them in her mind. One set of heavy prints, one lighter, and something else, half hidden in the mud, a faint trail of drag fabric. A woman's ham. She turned as footsteps approached. It was Alicia Redford, wrapped in mourning black, her silver hair pinned high. "I suppose you think me heartless," she said. "I've shed no tears." "Tears are not the measure of grief," Miss Marple replied gently. "Some cry inwardly for years." Alicia's composure faltered. "He was all I had left," she whispered, "and yet he hated me for protecting him. He called me cruel." "Sometimes," said Miss Marple, "the cruelest act is protection itself." The older woman turned toward the sea. "You understand more than most. You've seen what love can do." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "and what greed can disguise as love." For a long moment neither spoke. Then Alicia asked, "Do you believe they'll find who killed him?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think the truth already knows where to be found. It simply waits for the right confession." Later that night, long after the lamps were dimmed, Miss Marple heard a sound in the corridor, a door creaking open, hesitant footsteps. She rose quietly, candle in hand, and followed the sound down the passage to the small anteroom beside the study. Inside, Clara Davenport stood before the window, her eyes rimmed red, her hands clasped tightly around a small velvet pouch. "I can't live with it any longer," she whispered when she saw Miss Marple. "I have to tell someone." Miss Marple closed the door gently. "Then tell me, my dear." Clara's voice shook. "He wasn't going to leave her. He said so that night. I begged him, but he laughed, said I was nothing. I ran out into the storm. I wanted to disappear. But when I came back, I found him already dead." She opened the pouch. Inside lay a gold locket, smeared with dried blood. "I dropped this beside him when I tried to wake him. I thought they'd hang me for it." Miss Marple took the locket carefully. Studying the monogram, "This was not yours," she said. "No," Clara murmured. "It was his mother's." At dawn, Miss Marple requested a private word with Inspector Hale. They walked along the shore, the waves whispering at their feet. "You found your killer?" he asked. "I've found something more troubling," she answered. "A truth too human for courtrooms." She explained what she had pieced together. Julian's anger, Alicia's desperation, the will that chained them both to wealth and misery. He had confronted his mother, demanding money to run away with Clara. When she refused, he struck her. In the struggle, she seized a poker, perhaps to frighten him, perhaps in panic, and when it was over, the storm drowned her scream. Inspector Hale frowned. "You're certain?" "I am," she said. "But there's no proof that would stand. Only a mother's silence, and a locket left behind." He sighed heavily. "Then justice." "Justice," Miss Marple replied, "is sometimes knowing the truth and choosing what to do with it." That evening, Miss Marple visited Alicia one last time. The older woman stood by the fire, staring into the flames. On the mantel lay the gold locket, polished clean. "I suppose you know," Alicia said quietly. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but I think the world need not." Alicia's eyes glistened. "He was so angry. I only meant to stop him." "I know," Miss Marple said. "Love is rarely gentle and often cruel." The two women stood together in silence as the sea murmured beyond the cliffs. When Miss Marple finally turned to leave, Alicia's voice stopped her. "Will you tell them?" "No," she said softly. "Some confessions belong only to God." That night, a single lamp burned in the window of Windmere House until dawn. When morning came, the lamp was out, and Alicia Redford was gone. Her body was found at the base of the cliffs, the tide lapping gently around her skates. Inspector Hale called it an accident. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply placed a sprig of heather upon the stone wall and walked away, her knitting bag clasped firmly in her hand. In her heart she carried no triumph, no satisfaction, only the familiar sorrow of one who has seen too much of human weakness. Love, lust, and greed had played their parts as they always did, weaving tragedy from the threads of the ordinary. And somewhere beyond the cliffs, the sea kept its secrets. The tide returns. Final chapter. There's a stillness that comes after tragedy. Not peace, not forgiveness, but something colder. It lingers in the walls, in the creak of floorboards, in the echo of footsteps long gone. Windmere House stood silent now, its windows shuttered, its grand corridors hollow with memory. A month had passed since Alicia Redford's death. The newspapers called it an unfortunate accident. The coroner spoke of treacherous cliffs, loose earth, and grief too heavy to bear. No one asked whether she had fallen or jumped. Perhaps they already knew the answer, and simply lacked the courage to say it aloud. Miss Marple remained the village inn for a few days longer, her presence quiet, almost invisible. She walked the paths around the bay each morning, her shawl drawn tight against the wind. The sea, ever patient, went about its wake, swallowing, smoothing, forgetting. To the casual eye, she seemed the same as ever, but those who looked closely might have seen that her knitting had grown slower, her gaze more distant, her silences longer. It was on one such morning that Inspector Hale found her seated on a bench overlooking the cliffs. "The inquest closed," he said. "You were right about the boy and his mother. Pity there will be no trial." "Trials," Miss Marple murmured, "rarely cure the disease. They only treat the symptoms." He sighed. "Do you ever grow tired of seeing people at their worst, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly. "No, Inspector, only sad that they so rarely know it themselves." He looked at her for a long moment, then touched the brim of his hat and walked away. That evening, as the light faded into the gray hush of dusk, Miss Marple packed her things. The landlady helped her with the last of the bags, chattering kindly about weather and buses and the dullness of village life. Miss Marple listened politely, nodding at all the right moments. When the woman left, she stood alone by the window, looking out toward the bay. Across the water, the silhouette of Windmere House loomed dark against the horizon, empty now, shuttered and lifeless. And yet, one could almost imagine a candle flickering faintly in an upper window where Alicia had once stood. Miss Marple's eyes lingered there, not in fear, but in that quiet contemplation that so often followed her cases. To others, Windmere Bay would become a story, the tale of a wealthy family destroyed by greed and passion. But to her, it was something simpler, sadder. It was another proof that evil rarely comes roaring. More often, it whispers in familiar voices. She thought of Julian's anger, of Clara's desperate love, of Alicia's terrible choice, and of the sea, which had swallowed their sins without judgment. The following morning, Miss Marple boarded the early coach bound for St. Mary Mead. The driver, a cheerful man who smelled faintly of tobacco and sea salt, asked where she'd been staying. "Oh, just visiting friends," she said with a smile. As the coach climbed the hill, she looked back one last time at the bay. The sun was rising, gilding the waves in gold, yet the cliff below remained in shadow, steep, black, and endless. The tide was out, revealing the rocks where Alicia had met her end. Gulls circled above, crying mournfully, as though guarding the secret they alone could witness. Miss Marple watched until the house disappeared behind the curve of the hill. Only then did she take out her knitting and begin again, the soft click of needles filling the silence. There was comfort in the rhythm, in creation after destruction, order after chaos. Each stitch a small defiance against the world's cruelty. Yet even as she worked, her mind wandered. She thought of how love and greed, those eternal twins, had danced once more around Windmere's dying fire. How each heart there had sought warmth, and how each had found ruin instead. She wondered, as she often did, whether mercy was truly a kindness or merely another form of delay. By the time she reached the village, the day was bright, the fields green and shimmering in the sun. Children played in the lanes, laughter carrying on the wind. No one there would know what she had seen. No one would guess that beneath the smile of a quiet old lady lay the weight of another soul's tragedy. Miss Marple stepped down from the coach, thanked the driver, and walked toward her little garden gate. The roses had bloomed while she was away, pale and perfect in the light. She paused to touch one, her glove hand lingering on its delicate petals. "You do well, my dears," she murmured, "so long as no one looks too closely at the thorns." Then she went inside, closing the door softly behind her. Outside, the church bells began to ring, slow, distant, mournful, and somewhere far away on the cliffs of Windmere Bay, the tide returned. It always did,